Hello everyone, Guillaume Netsman here, host of the E-Commerce Wizards podcast, where I feature leaders in e-commerce and business. Today's guest is Josh Ward, who's the VP of Sales at Nexcess Hosting. So obviously we'll be talking about e-commerce hosting, more specifically what is different in hosting a PWA, Progressive Web App, Magento e-commerce store versus a regular e-commerce build. Before we get started, our sponsorship message.
This episode is brought to you by MageMontreal. If a business wants a powerful e-commerce online store that will increase their sales, or to move piled up inventory to free up cash reserves, or to automate business processes to reduce human processing errors, our company, MageMontreal, can do that. We've been helping e-commerce stores for over a decade. Here's the catch. We're specialized and only work on the Adobe Magento e-commerce platform, also known as Adobe Commerce. We're among only a handful of certified companies in Canada. We do everything Magento related. If you know someone who needs design, support, training, maintenance, or a new e-commerce website, email our team at support@MageMontreal.com or go to MageMontreal.com. That's MAGE Montreal.com.
All right, Josh, thanks for being here today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know you're talking e-commerce hosting all day long, so let's just jump right into it. The PWA hosting versus regular hosting for Magento, also known as Adobe Commerce, what's the difference?
Wow. Sometimes nothing, depending on the size of the site, but also sometimes everything. So it can get really interesting. I think anytime, PWA is beyond Adobe, when it's just content, are probably a little bit more straightforward, but of course, anytime you add e-commerce into that, things get a little tricky. I would start with, I know, Adobe's got their, list, they've got their kit, right? Here are the things that you need. Here's how you approach PWAs when it comes to Adobe and Magento. But, you may or may not be surprised to know that not everybody who comes to us looking to host PWAs with Magento follows that prescribed, that architecture. So sometimes just, figuring out what JavaScript framework are they using? What libraries do they need? That sort of thing can be, that's sort of the first obstacle, I think, typically that we're trying to overcome, making sure that there's no compatibility issues there. So that's interesting. The second one is, just how much client-side caching are you planning on doing, and where are you planning on doing that? Right. So one of the advantages on the PWA side is, hey, it's all right there on your phone. The app runs there. It's going to cache the last 5 or the last 10 products or whatever maybe you looked at. But if you actually want to go buy those products, you start to have to think about, well, what's the inventory? How's shipping going to work? What's the payment type? And a lot of that doesn't happen, again, depending on how you've set the PWA up, a lot of that doesn't or can't happen right in the PWA, and so now you have to query Magento, and then that takes server resources. And so, how often is that happening? All right, those are our things that we have to consider on our end. Is sort of how did you architect it? What does your visitor normally do? Right? How many pages do they normally look at? How many products do they buy? What kind of search are they looking at? So that we understand a little bit more how your traffic flows back to the sort of the home server, right, or your source server. So that's a biggie for us. A lot of times, customers come to us, thinking PWA, it's lightweight, so I don't need much hosting. But again, if you're processing a whole bunch of orders, you still need the order processing engine, right? I mean that transaction, at least in part, is going to have to take place again back at the home server, and so we're not always able to sort of slash your hosting infrastructure in half just because you're working on a PWA. And then the last piece I would throw in there that's different is it is this additional level of complexity. And I'm a pretty firm believer that the typically the more complex things get, usually the more expensive they're going to get. Like it's really hard for us to see a situation, where the same store, right? If everything else is apples to apples, and all you're doing is comparing a PWA version versus a non-PWA version, again, kind of going back to this cost thing, the PWA version is more complex. It just, I mean, at the end of the day, it is. And that's, whether we're, doing a lot of leveraging from a CDN standpoint to help with that, or we're doing it on the, again, on the infrastructure that we're providing. There's just, there's more complexity, there's more expertise. This is not shared hosting. And so there's just additional complexity and an additional cost that goes with that. And so those are, I would say, those are the things that probably the big three things that we consider that I don't know, right? Somebody who's not focusing on hosting every day is maybe not always thinking about.
Okay, so you first say, like, there's no one size fits for all recipe. You want to look what is the agency or the company building their e-commerce store on PWA looking to use as a tech stack, not necessarily because also this is something else that people may not realize. The PWA does sort of explode the tech stack out there, because sure, your backend is still going to be, let's say, Adobe Commerce or Magento in this case here, but then the front end, there's so many ways to build it. Maybe you use Adobe's Magento PWA Studio and you build this with React and all that, or maybe you don't and you go with like Vue storefront, and then it's going to be Vue.js instead of React. It's going to be a different approach. Maybe you want to manage your content with a completely different editor. And then we have these clients coming to us who have already built a PWA site on Magento for the backend, and then they want support, but they're like arranging that strange tech stack that we've never seen. And you have to think about that up front when you're building the website, because then, for example, my support team says there's no way we're learning this, just like for one account like that. So you have to be careful if you go off what is the main stack, from such as the Vue storefront or the Magento PWA Studio, when you build the site, both for support and for hosting of that system afterward.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is right. It's the beauty of open source, and also the bane of open source sometimes, right? Is you can mix and match these things as in a million different ways, right? You don't have to always follow the instructions in the Lego box, and you can make some really cool stuff. But then trying to support those really cool things is right. That's your job and my job, and that can be really tricky.
Right. And do you have any preference and say, or a default recommendation, you should use like 2 servers or virtual instance versus one? Let's say one for the PWA and one for the application, the Magento backend, where you do all the API calls, or does it not matter and you can still put everything on the same like dedicated server?
Yeah, that's a great question. Certainly we would prefer, dedicated instances rather than, sort of, anything that's shared when you're in PWA world. The other piece is, there's really not a one size fits all. We have run into situations where somebody comes to us, they're using Adobe's toolkit, they're using React. It is, as PWAs go, it's pretty straightforward, right? They followed the playbook, and it's not a, it's not a massive site, right? And in that case, everything on one server would, I mean, we've had a couple of those and we haven't had any problems, right? But for that to be true, it's just got to be a very, like a vanilla, like I said, a vanilla build, right? Here's what we would expect a PWA to look like. And so it comes to us and it's, everything's documented and we're good to go. And again, traffic volumes are relatively low and so we're good. It doesn't take much deviation from that kind of vanilla, script for us to go, yeah, now it's time for 2 servers, right? It doesn't take the traffic volume to go up much. It doesn't take much, deviation, right? Now, all of a sudden we scrapped React and we're using, something else. We're not following this playbook. Things just, our experience says things get really interesting at that point, and it's better to have some isolation, have at least 2 servers, And then, and then we start to think about how, again, how much traffic do you have? Do we need how much scalability do we need from a clustered standpoint, right? What are your HA requirements? Do you have product releases on a daily basis or on a weekly basis? So your traffic's going up and down and up and down and up and down, right? And so we're kind of architecting based on some of those characteristics, plus the PWA, the uniqueness of the PWA. And so then we have two plus servers going. So yeah, I mean, is it possible to do it? My short answer is it's possible to do it on one server. It's certainly possible. It doesn't happen frequently though. Doesn't happen frequently.
Right. You can run into other kind of problems you're aware of, like, I don't know, indexing, index size, or stuff like that, or some other things that people don't necessarily know as much is user groups also generate a lot more server demand that it's an additional set of index. So you have, let's say, your wholesaler, your retailer, and group price 1, group price 2, group price 3. And then Magento has to upkeep all this. And for each, let's say, price volume for each SKU, and if you have a million SKU, and then you have like millions of indexing data like that.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's another great call out. What's your inventory system, right? How are you pulling those product SKUs in, right? What's sort of your source of truth for all that? Each one of those adds additional complexity to the system, and when you're adding that, like, you're expecting, I would say from a hosting standpoint, typically you're expecting two things. One, you're expecting more servers, and two, you're probably expecting a higher cost, right? All those things, whether it's from a support perspective or, sheer resource need perspective, that's all really important. We do, we're not architects of the application, right? We're not building, developing, or whatever. We do push back at times, though, is the more we see, right? If you're trying to update inventory from third-party systems multiple times a day, and you're trying to run a PWA on top of that, which, again, additional complexity, we're going to suggest that you do things differently, right? Now, sometimes that doesn't work with your business model or the way you're going to market with something, and so we understand that, right? Can't always say no. But when you can, like, we try and help customers simplify the way that works, because the PWA should mean, less time with the database, right? Ideally, less time with the database. When you start adding all those crons and the different queries and everything that you have to do, you're creating more time with the database, and that's not a helpful thing, right? That's when you'll start to see, well, I'm running a PWA, but I'm seeing slowdowns, right? And it's not because of the PWA didn't cause that, right? It's the complexity with all the other things going on.
So, like you say, cost tends to be higher because it's a more complex system. Do you have like any kind of rule of thumb or ballpark tends to be roughly this order of magnitude larger, or this to this, or?
Yeah, so, again, I'll kind of lean on, if we look at really simple PWA setup, right, that we could fit on a single server, right? You're looking at maybe 20% higher than if that same setup was on say it was non-PWA, right? Just a regular Magento site. Yeah, maybe we're looking at additional 20% for some of those additional considerations. When you get complex, right? When you go, no, can't run this on a single server, got to at least run two, and let's go from there. You're talking probably 2 to 2.5 times, from a price point. 2 to 2.5 times the cost, because you've introduced that complexity. Now there's shades in there, right? It's not always 2 to 2.5 times. The larger you get, I mean, you start to see some efficiencies at scale, right? So, if we had a customer come to us and it was going to be like a 20 server cluster, right? So non-PWA, it's 20 servers. Now they're going to run a PWA, and we're going to say, well, now it's 22 servers, right? You're not going to pay 2.5 times, right? The cost isn't going to be 2.5 times because you already have a pretty big setup as it is. And so that, the bigger you get, you start to see that number come back down where, maybe you're paying, 20% more and not 250% more. Right. But there's certainly sort of a middle ground, a transition period that happens. That's, realistically probably around the $1,000 a month mark for us, right? Whatever that might look like, right? When you're transitioning, you need multiple servers, you have a PWA in place, where you introduce that complexity, you don't have any additional traffic, but because that extra complexity is there from the way you've built the site, you're going from $1,000 a month to $2,500 a month, right? Something like that.
Right. And is there any preference on, like, should you go with a dedicated machine? You go like bare metal? You go with a standard VM virtual machine, or you go with a cloud product, or you should like go to a cluster setup? And people might even wonder, like, oh, you have two servers, are they in a cluster? I'm guessing not. They're just like connected locally together, and the cluster would be if you need additional app server. But can you like cover a little bit the architecture choice like that?
Yeah. Yeah. So like I said, it would need to be dedicated, right? For us, that would mean either bare metal, right? So dedicated physical hardware, or just not part of our larger, Magento cloud hosting, right? So we have a very tailored version of our for Magento Cloud, but it's the entire environment is really tailored, and it's built for the largest common use case, and PWA isn't part of that, and so not really tailored for it. Now, we can still take our cloud platform, sort of divorce it from what we typically do with Magento, right? And just now we've got dedicated VMs in a cloud environment, right? So we can virtualize those dedicated servers, but they're still, right. If a support tech logs into the server, they're not really going to be able to tell the difference unless they really dig into seeing where that instance lives, right? It looks and feels and acts a lot like our dedicated bare metal solutions do, and so that I would say that's number one. That's very important. Got to be dedicated, not any sort of multi-tenant type environment, right? I think that's important. And that's for all the customizations, right? Largely, it's so we can get really custom for whatever the customer's building. And then in terms of multiple servers, yeah, I mean the starting point. You're right. I don't know if you would call it a cluster. A lot of times we'll call it, we'd refer to it like as a 2-node cluster, 2-node setup, right? Where you've got sort of a front end and a back end, right? And they're not really clustered, to your point. They're just sort of networked together, right? They can talk to each other really easily. But there's no load balancer, right, in the mix. Adding resources to a setup like that means making those servers bigger, right? Or making those VMs bigger, adding resources, right? Additional CPUs, RAM, whatever it might be. So you can do some vertical scaling, right, on those 2 nodes. But it's really hard to add a third node into it, right, when you don't have a load balancer. And then the step up from there would be load balanced. And that's kind of where, like, how much does your need for capacity change, right? What are your traffic spikes like? Are they consistent? Do you just have one big sale around Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and so that's all we need to plan for? Is it weekly, monthly? How big is your email list? All those fun things that drive traffic to your site, and how frequently it drives traffic. Then we can kind of plan for capacity, and maybe a cluster is needed. Maybe you just need 2 bigger servers, right? But the dedicated piece is really important. We have some really fun features and tools with the dedicated or with the Magento cloud stuff that we do, it doesn't work with PWA because we have to get too custom.
All right. So just to finish this as a shotgun question, is there anything else that people should know or think about, or that you'd like to share about hosting PWA versus hosting regular Magento e-commerce build?
I would maybe I would point back to you, and I would say, talk to your developer. Have a discussion with your developer around, what your long-term plans are, and what what they would suggest, right? What's going to be the most sustainable in the long term? That would be my maybe I'm cheating a little bit. That's not necessarily a hosting a hosting consideration, but that planning affects your hosting costs, right? And so and how well we can sort of get custom and perform for a customer, right? The more custom it is, the more resources it requires on our end, and that onboarding period is going to be longer, and just there's a lot of sort of costs that you're gonna see down the road if you don't plan really well up front, and that planning is typically going to happen with your developer and not necessarily with your hosting company. So to build those plans really well in the beginning, and then I think the hosting works itself out way better.
Yeah, and we've already covered on this, like stick to, mainstream tech paths so that's easier for you if ever you need to define yourself a different company for the support or for the hosting or for whatever else, not go too fringe. PWA is already a sort of new up and coming thing. It's been up and coming for a few years, but hey, new tech takes time to arrive. So yeah, the Adobe PWA Studio, View Storefront is the two biggest ones. There's also the Scandi PWA team that is fairly popular. Like, don't go too crazy and exploring too big of a mix and match, because actually a lot of agency would actually turn that down as a support Frankenstein piece of tech if it's too crazy when you arrive and want to shop around for another agency if ever the need is there. So that's it. Well, thank you, Josh, for being here today. If somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Yeah, drop me an email, jward, JWARD at nexcess.net. Hit me up direct there. Also, I am Josh D. Ward. D is in David on most social media. So LinkedIn is probably my favorite. Feel free to connect there, and yeah.
All right. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you.